guys, and welcome back to another video. So today I'm working on a watercolor piece and I want to talk a bit about color palettes and specifically the technique that I used today and how I arrived to the actual colors that I use in this piece. So for a lot of different pieces that I work on, I have different results as far as how I think about the color palettes and how I go about it. But this is one particular technique that's very straightforward, and I find that it's the one way that really helps me have the most seamless experience. So I will talk a bit about some of the things I think about and how I made this piece come together. But I do want to talk a little bit about the line art really quick. So I am using micron pens. I'm using a mixture of colored, and I used a black micron pen as well. And it's actually been a while since I've used a black one, but I figured out the basic color palette before I started this one. That was very important for me for making sure that I had the placement for the microns correct. A lot of times lately I like to go in with a single color of micron for the whole piece if I know what temperature it's going to be and if pretty much everything's going to be referencing a similar color. Then I can use one color for the micron pen and then everything has that thread throughout it. But this one I wanted areas to be a very distinct color, so I needed to make sure that I didn't do all of it one color. So I did actually want her skin to be a warm skin tone, so I needed to make sure that that was brown based, and I also wanted her hair to be very dark, so I went in with a black micron. That way it would have that really dark line work to really support a darker color that goes on inside of it. And I think that I also used a little bit of green. I did use green for the water effects behind her as well. Okay, so we can talk about the color palette and how I arrive at them. So this little, I hesitate to call it a tip because it seems really simple, but I find that this thought process and me putting it into this way really helps me to be able to turn it into a very seamless experience and not really fight against it. But when I have pieces that I have a cornerstone color in the piece that I know that it without a doubt is going to be that color, or that area is going to be that color, or that item is going to be that color, it goes so much smoother. So for this one, I knew it was going to be an ocean painting, but I wanted it to be very tropical. So I have this green colored paint that I really love, and I wanted to use that as the basis for the background with some of the blues coming in. So once I knew that this very specific green color was going to be most of the background, I had that cornerstone. I had that element to build on top of it. So every other color related to that, it was either something that was going to complement it or was going to be something that stood out. And that instantly gives me structure to it. I find that the best time to come up with that cornerstone color is while I'm working on the sketch. I want something that ties into the actual piece that I'm doing with the mood that I want, but also if there's something specific that I want the local color to tie into that, that's where I get those ideas. So I really try to think about that from the beginning, and that way when I go into figuring out the color palette, I already have that figured out. I'm not wavering on that one particular color element, and everything else is just figuring out how they're going to complement and how they're going to come together. So again, I wanted everything to relate with that green color, and I'll actually list it down below, that specific green, because it is a really great green. I love it. But I knew that going from that, from having the green background, I wanted her hair to be a dark colored hair. I wanted the main color for that to actually be Payne's gray, because it is a cool, very dark blue actually color. And then I would have the highlights as that green color so that it was reflecting off of the background. And once I had that, I knew that I could include a little bit of blue in certain areas of her hair to reflect some of the blue that would be in the background. And that was just a building block. I started from the green to the blue that it would blend into, to the Payne's gray that would also blend into the green and the blue as well. And then when it came to her skin tone, I wanted it to be a cool red. So I wanted it to be more of a warm red, well, a warm skin tone to complement the green, so it had those ties to it. But I also wanted the shadows to be purple and to be a very cooled down version of it. And I paid extra attention to making sure that the shadows preserved that coolness to it so that it did still tie in with the background. It tied in with those blues. And a great way to do that is to use the same pigment in many of the colors that you're mixing. So I use that same blue that I had in the background. So here on the skin, where I was going with the complement or an almost complement of the greens, I still had that tie to it because it was mixed in with the blue, and the blue is mixing in with the green in the background, so it all flows from one to the next. And I'm really happy that I ended up including the very rich red details in this one. I do have a habit of really gravitating towards analogous color schemes. So I love colors that are right next to each other on the color wheel. They blend really well together, and I find them really harmonious and beautiful together. But I do have that habit of limiting myself a little bit more than I think I'd actually like. So this one I tried to push myself the step beyond, and I think that it does add a lot more interest to it, and there's more areas to keep the eye interested in looking at it and bouncing from one to the next. I also included a little bit more warmth in the background than I normally would have. So in certain areas where I had that really yellow-green in the background, I went in with a yellow and an orange and just gave these little flicks of color so they would blend in with that green, and I love the effect of it. I loved having those warmer patches in there as well. It adds a certain sophistication to it that going with just the greens and just the blues wouldn't have had. So I do feel that like that's a decision that I normally would never have made, but I'm really happy that I'm pushing these colors that normally I might not think should be there and being able to see this really interesting effect to it. I think that that's a really exciting experience because it is pushing me beyond where I am right now with my color theory and with how I like to work with color. So being able to have these new experiences with how I'm using colors is just really exciting and inspiring to work on new pieces and figure out new ways that I can incorporate that kind of concept. And when it finally came time to painting her shirt, which I was very glad I finally got to because having that really stark element of white kind of threw off the rest of the painting. But when I finally got to that point, I had a few options. So in my color comps that I did before I started painting, I had her shirt that is as an olive green, so a more desaturated version of what you had in the background. And I wasn't sure that was necessarily the right choice. I ended up going with more of a beigey gray, a warm gray, and I think that really helped, not having too many areas of strong color and not giving it something that would attract the eye too much, because I didn't want the shirt to be a focal point. I wanted it to be something that blends into the background. But I also wanted it to mirror a little bit with the shark, which actually is a focal point. So it was a little bit of a interesting duality where I knew that the color in one area would be less of a focal point, but because the shark is in the middle of a lighter bubble, that is, and because everything around the shark is very saturated, going in with this gray and a darker gray will help it stand out, whereas going with a nice soft gray for her shirt next to the Payne's gray hair, it would blend in. So it's interesting in that way that you can have the same color in different areas in a painting and they'll have completely different effects. But I did really like that they still had that tie, so there weren't too many different elements, that it helped bring your eye from one to the next without bringing the eye to the shirt instead of to different focal points. I also wanted to really consider how I was going to create this glowing effect on her skin. I have green as the glow. That's where the most light is coming from in this painting, but I didn't want it to be really stark on her skin. I wanted it to feel bright and light and like it was still this colored light, but it wasn't really strongly green against her more warm skin tone. So I ended up going with more of a muted yellow, which I think was relatively successful. It has those ties to the green, but it still has a little bit more harmony with the red as well. And I think that was an effect that I'm really happy with. I've been struggling with finding a way to really achieve a glowing effect in watercolor in a way that I'm satisfied with. And while I don't think that this is the perfect technique to get the exact look that I want, it is definitely something in the right direction. It's a lot closer to what I want than I've ever really been able to achieve in the past, especially with the face. I've always really struggled a bit with getting good highlights and glowing effects on skin, so I feel like this is at least taking me that way where I want to be with it. But again, I did want to make sure that it wasn't a really stark color against her face, so I went with that yellow color. Okay, so I want to do just a really quick recap over the pattern of how I figured out what colors I wanted to use for this one. So, like I said, I like to start off with a central cornerstone color that I know is going to be in there, and that was the green for the background, and then I knew I wanted to blend it into a blue so that it had more interest to it and it wasn't so flat. So it went from the green to the blue, and then I knew that the hair would be dark, so that was the Payne's gray that also had the green and the blue from the background in there as well. And then I went to the contrasting red colors that I'd have in her skin, as well as the very red detailing for her lips and the hair barrette. And then I went to the gray, which is nice and neutral, but it still had just a hint of green in it as well, and then a little bit more of the blue in the shadows. And I find that when I map out how I think about color, it's very helpful for me going into the future to be able to work through pieces in particular that I'm really struggling with. I find that the ones that I have a really hard time with, I'm trying to think of the whole painting all at once. What are all the colors going to be? But when I try to think about it this method and applying it to the ones that I'm struggling with, it really does help clarify what my best path is to coming up with a good color palette. And that is it for today. I do have the original of this painting as well as prints of her available at my art shop. There's a link down in the description, and there's a link to all the tools that I used to create this painting down there as well. I will be back next week with another video, so thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you then.